Hello, everybody. This is Dr. John Wineland again, coming to you with another lecture this morning. This morning we're going to talk about the role of infant baptism in the Brush Run Church with the Campbells early on. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So as you can see, here we have an image of the Brush Run Church, probably appearing in about the 1925 to 1930. It was moved to this location on the campus of, or near the campus of Bethany College in Bethany, West Virginia, to preserve it from its original location. Some 20 miles, 15 to 20 miles away in Pennsylvania. So the idea here of infant baptism becomes a big issue. And so that's what we want to take a look at today. So infant baptism and baptism in general will be a troubling issue for the Campbells and, of course, for the Restoration movement, and in some it's sort of wrapped up in the whole issue of baptism, which I guess could still be an issue with the Restoration movement today. This is a picture of Thomas Campbell. We see he writes, "Where the Scriptures speak, we speak. Where the Scriptures are silent, we are silent." Thomas Campbell, as he was looking through the Scriptures to see where he should, what he should say about infant baptism, of course, he comes quickly to the realization that infant baptism is not either mentioned, nor described, nor illustrated in the New Testament. You can't find any occasion of it taking place. So he said, well, it's not in the Scripture. And so therefore, the Scriptures are silent about that issue. So at the time, he said, well, we're going to put that in a matter of opinion and leave it that way for now. And so we'll see then that this is the way things happen in the Restoration movement. There is a kind of movement, a progression to certain principles that were not there practiced previously. It's going to take time for them to come to these things. But he said no need to rebaptize, and so they just sort of had many other issues, of course, to deal with at the time. Now, some within the Christian Association of Washington wanted to push the issue more, probably than Thomas Campbell did at the time. But he had, other fish to fry at that point. And so he did not push it at that time. We're going to see it's actually going to take a major event in the family, the Campbell family, to bring this to the forefront. Now here's a map that shows us the areas we're talking about. Of course, you can see West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. This is Virginia. Now you have to remember at this time, West Virginia was not separated from Virginia. That doesn't happen until the time of the Civil War, when West Virginia splits from Virginia. But West Virginia does have panhandles. One of these panhandles is located up here, where Bethany is located. But here is Pennsylvania, and here is Washington, Pennsylvania. Up here is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And not very far from Bethany is the Brush Run Church. It's just across the state line. You can still go to the site of the Brush Run Church today. I've been to it several times. I've taken students there, actually, when we would take a field trip to Bethany College, and the Campbell Mansion, as they call it, the Campbell House, the meeting house they had there, and then we would go out to the site of the Brush Run Church. At any rate, the Brush Run Church starts here. The picture you saw is where they end up moving the building and kind of restoring it in Bethany. to preserve it. Now, here's a nice photograph of the Brush Run Church. See, it is in some disrepair at this point. It's now completely disappeared. If you go to Bethany, it was located on the grounds not too far from the Campbell mansion or house, but nothing of it remains today, and it hasn't been there for several years. So, unfortunately, it is not preserved. Well, they have basically, Thomas Campbell, if you remember, was basically said, you have to leave. Well, first he said, you can't have a congregation. You can't preach. Because they didn't like what he was doing with communion. They didn't like how sort of open he was. And so when the Washington Association decided to create a more sort of permanent congregation, that's when the Brush Run Church was formed. However, it had no peers. It had no one to fellowship with. So they just had this small building, and they had a small number of members, and they tried to associate with the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians said, no, you're not Presbyterians. Thomas Campbell did not want division, but they refused. Said, no, we won't let you. You're not a part of us. Even though you are ordained as a Presbyterian minister, you are out of fellowship with us because of the things that you have done. And so, when that happens, they are going to have to try something else. But I think it's very interesting. One of the main reasons that they cite for why he cannot have fellowship with the Presbyterians is they say that, and I'm sure this got to Thomas, that he's inconsistent in his view of the Scriptures. He said, well, you hold to baptizing infants, but you believe that was not taught in the Bible. So why do you hold to something that you say is not in the Bible? You say you're going to hold to the Bible. You don't want to hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith. You're going to hold to the Bible, the New Testament. You say it's not in there, but yet you were baptized as an infant. Your family was baptized as an infant. Most of the members in this group were baptized as an infant. You're not consistent. I think that kind of argument, especially coming from the Presbyterians, made Thomas Campbell think, maybe I'm not being consistent. Maybe I do need to address this issue. Well, in the meantime, of course, his son, Alexander, pictured here at the age of 26 in 1814, as a young man. Remember, he had left the Presbyterian Church. He had decided to leave the Presbyterian Church before he sailed to America. He left that communion token and didn't take communion with the Presbyterians at that point. When he meets up with his father, as we mentioned, his father says, well, I'm in trouble with the Presbyterians. I've basically been kicked out. And then Alexander said, well, I decided to leave. And so here they are. He shows him the Declaration and Address, and Alexander is quite taken with this approach. And so Alexander now, remember, was never licensed as a minister. He was never ordained as a minister. He was never a Presbyterian minister, as his father was. But of course, his father had high hopes that he would be a minister, a preacher. And he preaches his first sermon when he's about the age of 22, on July 15th, 1810. His first sermon text from Matthew 7, verses 24 through 27. It talks about the wise and the foolish builders. So you can read the text here. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew, beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had a foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man built his house on the sand. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell in a great crash. Well, he preached, but remember, he has no affiliation. He's not a Presbyterian. He's not a Presbyterian minister. He's not licensed to preach by the Presbyterians or any other group. And he's not been ordained. He also struggles with infant baptism at this point. What to do with it? Much like his father. He knows it's not in the Bible. But then again, what are we going to do? So pretty much everybody they knew had been baptized as an infant. We don't see it in the Bible. We want to follow the Bible. How are we going to do? Well, kind of put it again, kind of on the back burner. He knows it's an issue. He knows it's a problem, but he's not going to push it at this point. Well, he has other things on his mind, I suppose. One of those is a young lady by the name of Margaret. He meets Margaret Brown. Margaret Brown, he's living over near Brush Run in Pennsylvania, but not that many miles away, is a farm owned by John Brown. Thomas Campbell had borrowed some books from John Brown because, books were precious commodities, hard to come by, very expensive. He had borrowed some books from John Brown. And I think maybe Thomas was trying to be a bit of a matchmaker. Because what did he do? He asked his son to return these books to John Brown's house for him. Will you ride over and return these books? Thank him for the use of these books. And he rode over on a horse, and as he approached the house, according to some sources, there were a couple of young ladies in the parlor, in the sort of front room of the house. Margaret Brown, the daughter of John Brown, looks out the window, reportedly, and said, "There's a young man I'm going to marry." Now, is that a true story? I don't know. But it's kind of a good story, so I put it in. And Alexander comes up to the door. He returns the books. Of course, he lingers and talks with Margaret, gets to know her. Eventually, in March the 12th, 1811, he and Margaret Brown are married in that same parlor at John Brown's house. John Brown has several acres of land, a large farm, and a house, and of course a young daughter. So it's then in May 4th of 1811 that the Christian Association of Washington becomes the church at Brush Run. So he actually meets her and marries her before the Brush Run Church, a bit before the Brush Run Church is organized. Couldn't find any pictures of Margaret Brown, but I did find this. And it is a gold wedding ring that Margaret wore. So I think that's fitting to put a picture of it there. You see her initials on it, M.C. Margaret, at this point, Campbell. Now, when the Brush Run Church begins, they have communion every week. Unlike the Presbyterians and many other groups, they decide that's what they did in the Bible. They gathered together, as it says in the book of Acts, and they shared the apostles' doctrine, and they broke bread and prayed and so forth, as you probably have read in the book of Acts. In June 16th of 1811, that's when they actually start building the building that we showed you. That is the Brush Run Church building. And it's then in January the 1st, 1812, that Alexander Campbell is ordained to the ministry. Not ordained by any other group, any denomination, anything like that. He is simply ordained by the Brush Run Church. His father is an elder there. He becomes the ordained minister and the one who will do the bulk of the ministerial work and the preaching and so forth. Now, another major event will take place about a year later, a little over a year later, in March of 1812. So almost a year to the day that he gets married to Margaret. Margaret gives birth to Jane, and she's born March 13th, 1812. Now, here is, if you go across from the Campbell house in Bethany, what's called God's Acre, and this is basically a cemetery for the family, and then of course it has others that are in there, but there's kind of a enclosed area. Actually, you have to go up and over a wall, and that was mainly done to keep animals out of the graveyard. They didn't want animals grazing on the graves, walking on the graves, so they built a wall all the way around it. Inside of that wall, several graves. One of them, of course, is of Margaret Campbell. You can see that her tombstone is eroding, and pieces have fallen off. But before that happened, a transcription was made of the stone, and so here it is. In memory of Margaret Campbell, wife of Alexander Campbell, who was born January 29th, 1791. She died October the 27th, 1827. The age 36 years, 9 months, 23 days. She was, in truth, a good wife, a tender mother, a faithful and affectionate friend. She lived the life of a Christian and died full in the hope of a blessed resurrection unto eternal life. The last lines she had sung declare her views and feeling in the prospect of the grave, of death and in the grave. No terror the prospect begets. I am not mortality's slave. The sunbeam of life as it sets paints a rainbow of peace on the grave. So there you go. Margaret Campbell. Now, notice she dies pretty young here, and that's not uncommon. Today, women outlive men most of the time, usually by several years, average lifespan. The main reason for that is that today we have many advances medically around childbirth and early childhood and care of the woman. Many women would die in childbirth or as complications of childbirth. That doesn't happen as much today. And so therefore women outlive men today. That was not the case though in, I'll say, 100 years ago even, or 150 years ago, definitely. Okay, let's move on. Now, you might want to take a look at the Campbell Mansion, as it's called. It's in Bethany, West Virginia. Beautiful rolling hills, and here you can see in the background the mansion. It's actually, well, I'll show you. It was built in stages. And here is the sign, information sign from West Virginia. Alexander Campbell. Here lived the leading influence in America's largest indigenous religious movement. That's interesting. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ, founder of Bethany College, built in 4 periods, and that's what we're going to look at. The John Brown Mansion, completed in 1793. The Buffalo Seminary in 1819. The brick dining wing. Okay, so this part over here is the John Brown. You see the roof here of the John Brown part. This is the Buffalo Seminary, as it's called. You can't really see it in here, but the dining room's back in there. And then this, in 1840, is called Strangers Hall. And this is basically guest accommodations for people that would come and visit Alexander Campbell. And he had a lot of guests, actually, a lot of famous people. People like Calhoun, all right, Clay, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, Jefferson Davis, President Garfield, well, before he was president, James Garfield came too, and many, many others. They came in part because sometimes one of their relatives they're bringing them to the college to study, or other times they just have been invited and they decide to come. Alexander Campbell will build a very large estate here. He'll have acres and acres of land. He will raise sheep, and he develops a special breed of sheep, which is quite desired by those who raise sheep. And so he made a lot of money selling those sheep to people as well. Well, here is perhaps a better view of the front view. You still can't see the dining wing very well. It's hidden behind this bush. But to the right, this part, this was the John Brown mansion. So when she looked out from the parlor is right here. So when she looked out the parlor window and saw Alexander, and he came up there to return the books, it would have been right up in here. This would have been the house at that time. There's also a basement area down here that has a kitchen and so forth in it. And then, of course, once he moves in, when they're given the house and they're given the farm by John Brown. John Brown gives it to them for basically $1 and love, is what he says. So that's quite a gift. Then Alexander, much like remember his father had, started a school to train ministers and that sort of thing, train young men. And so he built this part, the Buffalo Seminary part of the house, which had rooms there where they could stay and rooms where he could teach. And that's you still walk through that upstairs there. They have a kind of small museum archives up there that you can see a lot of photographs and other objects from that. And then it stayed that way, as you can see, for, about 17 years. And then they decide, you know what? We need more space to eat. We have a lot of guests. We're getting a lot of people staying here. So they added on this part here. Not as tall, just one floor. And it's just a long dining room with a long table in it. And that's where they would entertain and feed. And kind of behind that was the kitchen area. In fact, the main kitchen was outside. This was often very common at this time because of the heat of the kitchen, also because of the risk of fire with a kitchen. And then finally, 4 years later, they add this part here. It's called Strangers Hall. And this is decorated with a special kind of French wallpaper that actually Alexander Campbell saw when he visited Andrew Jackson's house, the Hermitage in Nashville. And he liked it so much that he sent away for it, and they put it in this front room area here. And there's a front room here and 2 bedrooms. The front room has a fireplace and so forth. So this was for guests. That's why they call it Strangers Hall. Anyway, so that's the mansion. Since I can't physically take you there, sort of virtually give you a little tour, I thought this would be a good time to do that. Now, outside of this, later, Alexander will construct, because he wanted a place that would be quiet, and a place where he could study, and a place to store his books. He built study, and that's what you see here. See the walls? And notice there are no windows. There are little windows here next to the door, and then there's one window from up above. This is something he added. He was inspired to do this from Thomas Jefferson. He visited Thomas Jefferson at his house at Monticello, and he saw that Jefferson's office gives you a lot of bookshelf space, and you could be right in the center and be surrounded by your books. I like that idea myself. And so he built this, but he wanted more light. So he made one, I think, ingenious addition in his situation. He put this cupola, I guess you'd call it, of windows up above, so the light would come down over his desk and provide light. So he used to say, light comes from above. So kind of a double meaning there, right? And here's the inside. His desk would have been here, the bookshelves around, the light coming from above. So this is this door open. He did make an addition to it later. Yeah, there's the light from above, the windows that are up there. He will make an addition. This addition is added onto the back. You can see it in this photograph. So here is the study. But it got kind of chilly out there. And so he built on this a small addition to the back. And in it, he put a fireplace to heat the area. And it does have a couple of windows. So this is a different later construction added on. It's still all sitting there today in pretty good shape. And I think it's one of the interesting things to see. Now remember, it was inspired by Thomas Jefferson. Now here is an actual photograph of Alexander Campbell seated in this study. You can see back here, this is after the fireplace was put in. And he's surrounded by his books. And this is where he would do his writing. He wrote several books. You know, he translated the New Testament into English, and he would put out a journal every month. This is where he did a lot of his writing, right here, right in this spot, just as you see him there. So in 1832, he built this small separate brick study in the form of a hexagon, lit by this windows from above, and in 1836 he added the fireplace and window. And in his study he wrote 56 volumes as well of the Millennial Harbinger periodical. It was inspired by his visit to Monticello. And here I thought you might be interested to see, what does Thomas Jefferson's study look like? Well, of course, well preserved today, but you can see it has the same basic shape. Hexagonal shape, desk in the center, bookshelves around. Alexander Campbell was quite impressed with this, and so he decided, hey, I'm going to try to make something similar back at Bethany, and he did. Now let's get back to the issue of baptism and the immersion of the Campbells. Alexander Campbell, that's AC, when he has the child, now this daughter comes, and now the issue of baptism is no longer theoretical. It's no longer something to put on the back burner. Alexander Campbell had been sprinkled as a baby. Thomas Campbell had been sprinkled as a baby. In fact, pretty much all the people they knew, that's what it was as a Presbyterian. Now his child is born. What is he going to do? What should happen? I mean, an infant doesn't know what's going on, so typically, in their tradition of their family, and certainly the Presbyterians and lots of other groups, they would take the young baby, maybe just a few days or a few weeks old, they would take it to a church. They would be sprinkled, a little bit of water placed on the head. There would be a little ceremony. Sometimes they sort of walk the baby around the church, and everybody gets to see it, and everybody says, we will help the couple raise this child in the church. Well, when he has a child, he has to now make the decision. Is he going to allow his daughter to control her own salvation, to control her own baptism in the way that she wants to do it, and at a time that she wants to do it? Or is he going to follow the tradition of many generations of his family? And so this can be tough. But he finally, when he must face the issue, he decides, when Jane is born there in March, that they have to make a decision. And he decides that he is going to let his daughter make her own decision about baptism when she's able. So he does not have his daughter baptized as an infant. And so this marks the break, I think, with the Campbells, and when this issue became something they could no longer ignore. And this is when he accepts the idea that you must be immersed as a believer. In other words, you must know what's going on and be immersed. Now, the Campbells, didn't know about immersion. They had never immersed anyone. I don't even know how many times they actually saw somebody immersed. And so they sought out a guy who would know, a local Baptist minister named Matthias Luce, a Baptist preacher, who agreed to baptize the Campbells. And here is a photograph of him. As you can see, looks like a serious guy. And so he said, well, yes, I will baptize you without the usually required religious experience, because remember, the Baptists are highly influenced by John Calvin and Calvinistic thinking. And they don't believe baptism has anything to do with your salvation. They believe that baptism is merely something you do out of obedience. You've already been placed amongst the elect by God. And now, since Jesus was baptized, well, you'll be baptized. But it's not about salvation. It's about obedience. It's about sort of a public confession or statement that you are following Christ. Or perhaps he thought a whole group of former Presbyterians who want to be immersed, maybe that was a religious experience somehow. Anyway, he does it. And where does it take place? Well, here's the road, windy road to Bethany. And we follow it around, and you turn here. I've been on this road several times. And you go up here now today. There's an old schoolhouse, and they're showing you how to get to the Brush Run Church. It's up on a hill. It's a not beautiful location. But this is where it once sat. Well, there's no baptistry in the Brush Run Church. Matter of fact, that's a hard thing to do, indoor plumbing. So people would go to outdoor places. And we see that here is a picture of the creek, the stream where they are baptized. The Campbell's baptism site, June 12th, 1812. So there it is. There's the location. And here I have some other pictures of the location. You see it's just a sort of a stream or a creek. And this is where they were baptized. You know, the Baptists knew all these good locations because you had to have a place where you could actually get down to the stream of water, or the river or whatever, and be able to get down there and get back. And it had to also be deep enough and situated in such a way that it was safe to take people down in there and immerse them. So they had baptism spots that they knew about. And so that's where the Campbells go. And in fact, they decide, if the baby's not going to be baptized, and this is really what's taught in the scriptures, then we can no longer just sit back and leave this an issue that we're not going to resolve. And so they do. And so on this day, June 12th, 1812, Alexander and his wife, Thomas Campbell and his wife, and Alexander's sister, Dorothea, and in addition, Mr. and Mrs. James Hannon from the church, all to go down, and they are immersed in the Buffalo Creek, baptized in the Buffalo Creek in June of 1812. Now, pretty soon, almost everybody from the Brush Run Church is immersed, undoubtedly in the same spot. This is the baptism spot. And so baptism now, infant baptism, is something they have dealt with, something that basically everyone has accepted and actually done. So now, since the Presbyterians don't want them, and since Matthias Luce is convinced they are Baptist, I mean, you might say, if it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, it's a duck, or it's a Baptist. If you're going to be immersed, you're not a Presbyterian anymore, you're a Baptist. And of course, the Campbell said, no, we're not Baptists. We don't want to join the Baptists. We just want to follow the Bible. And this is what the Bible teaches, the way we read it. And so anyway, I think he sort of thought, well, you guys just don't realize yet that you're Baptist. And so the Presbyterians wouldn't have them when they formed the Brush Run Church. And, they got about 30 members. Thomas Campbell, the first elder, Alexander, the first preacher. They had 4 deacons, and then he's ordained. And of course, after they are baptized, now they're eager to have some people that they can have fellowship with, and so the Baptists are open to it, and so they say, well, we don't think that we have joined the Baptist church, but the Baptists accept us. And so they begin to have fellowship with the Baptists. And Alexander said, well, as long as I can preach the Bible, then yeah, that's fine. And of course, they agreed. So here is I like this drawing of the Brush Run Church. I think it shows the setting out in the woods up on that hill in Pennsylvania, which I think is nice. But it's an independent church. So we're not Presbyterians. We're not Baptists. What are we? We're just the Brush Run Church. They chose their own leaders. They made up their own rules as a congregation. They had weekly communion, and they had no creeds. They said, we're just going to follow the Bible as our only rule of faith and practice. And there came a point where 3 people wanted to join who had never been baptized. They had not been sprinkled. And so they were immersed, you see. And soon, most everybody in the congregation is immersed. Okay? So baptism plays a big part of this. And I think it still does today. This is probably one of the defining issues if you talk to somebody about Christian churches, the Churches of Christ, the Restoration Movement, Alexander Campbell. They're going to immediately go to baptism. I've had a lot of people talk, Baptists and others. They want to talk about baptism because baptism is sort of the defining issue. And in fact, I don't think it's uncommon today that in some congregations they downplay baptism so that they can be more evangelical or whatever you want to call it. So they kind of downplay baptism or the issue of baptism. Remember when we talked about baptism, 3 parts to it: mode, meaning, and subject, right? Mode, that's how you do it. Is it going to be sprinkling, pouring, or immersing? Right? That's the mode. The subject, okay, so the mode is the how, the subject is the who. Is it going to be typically an infant that doesn't know what's going on, or somebody who's older who does know what's going on? Okay, and then, of course, the most controversial, I think, is the meaning, and this is the why. Why should you be baptized? The mode, the meaning, and the subject. The meaning, then, is why. And of course, some who do infant baptism see it as just a sort of pledge of the parents and the congregation that they'll be involved in a child's life and help to raise the child to know the church and to know Christ. It's sort of a covenantal sign, much like circumcision. That's what they relate it to, circumcision in the Old Testament. Groups like the Baptists, who would immerse believers, would say, well, it's just an outward sign of an inward faith. It's not about your salvation. It's just basically an act of obedience. And, of course, then the restoration position, if you want to call it that, as I've described it to you earlier, I see it much like marriage ceremony. This is where you're united to Christ. This is where salvation takes place. There are several passages that talk about baptism washing away your sins, how your baptism saves you. When Peter preaches that first sermon, they say, what shall we do to be saved? What does he say? In Acts 2:38, you probably have read it before. Tells him to repent and be baptized. Well, we could talk more about that, but I'm sure in other classes they will. So the baptism then. So, when these three, I'm kind of going back in time here, but when these three first show up to the Brush Run and they want to be baptized and they've never been baptized, well, they decide, okay, they want to be immersed. We're going to immerse them. But at this time, Alexander Campbell, Thomas Campbell had not been immersed. They didn't really know how to do it. And I think it's kind of interesting, if you've never baptized someone, there is a technique. You don't want to drown the person. So you put a hand, as you can see here in this, you put a hand on their back. You sort of grab or have them grab your wrist and you grab their wrist. And then you lower them as they bend their knees into the water and then lift them up. Now, if you're doing this outdoors in a stream where there's a current, you want to lower the person into the current so that when you lift them up, the current will help you raise the person up and not hold the person down. Your goal here is to immerse them and get them up out of the water, not to let this be a permanent watery grave. Well, anyway, they didn't know how to do it. They went to the Buffalo Creek. They went down to that deep pool. And I think it's interesting here that Richardson, who has a rather lengthy account of Alexander Campbell's life, gives a description. And this will be what we end with in this lecture. Richardson said, "The pool was narrow and so deep that the water came to the shoulders of the candidates." That's pretty deep when they entered it. "Thomas Campbell then, without going into the water, stood on a root that projected over the edge of the pool, bent their heads down until they were buried in the liquid grave, repeating at the same time in each case the baptismal formula. I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost." But so I think this would be a strange sight to see him immersing someone. Obviously, it's not something he maybe had done before, but not even getting in the water. He was sort of leaning over, and they got him way out there on their shoulders and just kind of pushed their head down into the water. And there you go. They're baptized. Now, there was one church where I preached that I didn't have to get into the water to baptize people. Very interesting. The baptismal area, the baptistry, had an area behind it, which was floor level. So I would walk on the floor level. I would stand there. The people would come up and down, whoever's going to be baptized, take the steps down into the baptistry. And then I could just lean over from the back and baptize them without actually getting into the water. But normally you got to get into the water with them and baptize them. Okay? Anyway, we better leave it there for today. More we could say always, of course. But I hope this helps you understand a little more about the Campbells, their struggles with coming to terms with just accepting the Bible, not tradition, not creeds and doctrines of the past. So I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk to you again later.